Welcome back to the Policy Viz podcast. I'm your host, Jon Schwabish. On this week's episode of the show, I am super excited to have with me Ellen Lupton, author of the third edition of the book Thinking with Type, as well as many other books, and we're going to talk about some of them in our conversation. Ellen's also professor at the Maryland Institute College of Art, MICA, in Baltimore. We talk about a whole host of things. We talk a lot about typefaces and fonts, as you might expect. We talk about her favorite and least favorite typefaces, whether she likes the word typeface or font. And we also talk about trying to be an inclusive designer, particularly when it comes to typefaces, and how to think more broadly and have in many cases, an international approach to your design work. And so if you are a data visualization practitioner or specialist and you are creating visualizations, infographics, charts, graphs, and diagrams, this is going to be the episode for you to learn more about how to be a more discerning consumer and producer and user of fonts and typefaces. And I think you're really going to love this episode. Ellen was great to talk with. We had such a good time, as you're going to see. And so I hope you'll enjoy this week's episode of the show. Make sure you rate or review the show wherever you get your podcasts, be it if you're watching this on YouTube or if you're listening to it on iTunes or Spotify. Wherever you get it, I hope you will rate or review the show. So with all that out of the way, let's get to this week's episode of the show, my interview with Ellen Lupton. Hi, Ellen. So great to meet you. Thanks for coming on the show.
I'm thrilled, John. Thank you.
This is very exciting. I've been a big fan for a long time, and now we have a third edition of your Thinking with Type book, which is, as were the other two editions here somewhere buried behind me. Great. This one seems kind of like, I don't want to say started from scratch, but seems like you really kind of started at the bottom and worked your way back up.
Yeah, I really rethought the whole thing and rethought some of the premises of the book, the voice of the book, and expanded the content in a big way.
When you look at people's, particularly for folks who listen to this podcast, looking at data visualizations, dashboards, infographics, such sort of thing, do you get the sense that data folks look at fonts last?
Maybe they should. You know, most typography isn't supposed to be in your face, like waving and jumping around. I'm a font. I'm a font. It's supposed to support the content. So that's okay. And I think for data viz folks to find some fonts that they really like and that work on the platforms that they use, that's a really great way to use typography and really focus on using those fonts well and clearly.
So what is, and this question kind of bleeds a little bit into your teaching work, and I'm just curious how you recommend folks think about using fonts in their work, how you teach fonts in class. How do you tell your students to go ahead and either design their own, or for probably most people, like, go choose a font that they think will work?
Well, we really talk about function and context and what you're trying to do. So often our students are creating really cool, hip, experimental projects, and they want fonts that are swoopy and pixelated and, super weird and in your face. And they often design their own fonts or just, letter forms or use technology in interesting ways to make surprising shapes. But we also need to know how to use typography so that it just works and that it doesn't surprise people when they're driving a car or navigating a hospital,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, yeah.
reading a book where you want the fonts to be beautiful and nice, but you don't want them to get in the way of the function and the tasks that people are trying to do.
Yeah. One of the things that I love about the new book is, in my recollection at least, is the revised, or I would probably say expanded section on typography in different languages, different parts of the world. And so, like, where did that come from? How do you think about taking a design in different languages, especially you move from kind of horizontal languages, left to right, then right to left, and then vertical? Like, how do you think about these transitions?
Well, I mean, this is called, internationalization and, web design and the idea of designing typographic systems that will work locally wherever they exist. And so it means choosing typefaces that support that and, understanding, the fluid quality of content. So, for example, Chinese takes up much less space than anything written in the Latin alphabet. It's just very compact. So you need like different amounts of space depending on the language. Um, Part of my goal in including diverse writing systems in the book was really to celebrate typography as a world phenomenon and that typography belongs to everyone and is practiced all around the world. It's not truly a practical guide to creating type in every writing system on the planet. The primary language of the book is English and the alphabet is Latin, but the book acknowledges this diversity of cultures and right through the history of type to the way type is practiced today.
Yeah. Does it bother you, the difference in people using the word type versus font? I know in the book you're like, "Ah, it doesn't matter, it's okay," but I'm just curious, like, how do you feel like does it bother you inside?
No, so that's a really interesting question. It's like people on the street are much more likely to be familiar with the word font than the word typeface. People working in the type industry is very important to them, the difference between that. I even had an argument with a friend of mine who's a big shot at Monotype, which is one of the biggest type producers and distributors on the planet, and I'm like, "Charlie, who cares the difference between fonts?" Fonts are software files, essentially,
Yeah.
and typefaces, which is the design, sort of considered separately from how it is made available to you through software or in olden times through metal or film files. And he, like, almost blew up. He's like, "I'm in this industry, and the complexity of, like, distributing these software files, making sure they work well on everybody's computer, that they translate among languages, that they conform to all kinds of standards for, software protocols and licensing,
Mhm.
right?" He says, "My whole life is fonts and
Right.
dealing with, these files, right? This
Yeah.
digital information." But for people on the street, the word font is very familiar. It's cute. It's a cute little four-letter word. So, I'm just not in the business of correcting people when they say font, when
Right.
really they mean typeface
Typeface.
or vice versa. And in my book, I think I'm pretty good at using the words correctly, but if a paragraph worked better saying font, you don't want to just keep repeating this big, long, 8-letter word when you can just
Right.
say font.
Yeah.
And people
They
understand
get it.
what you
Yeah, they
mean.
get it.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. I'm curious, about the building of the book. I mean, all of your books are amazing in their construction. I mean, I was saying to you before we started, like, I have all these books behind me, and so I have to start moving to Kindle books, but, like, or some sort of e-reader, which I don't love. Especially your books, so like they're just amazing to hold. And like, and we're gonna talk about your other book, Extra Bold, in just a little bit, which is like another one that is just has this great feeling about it. What is your process for doing that? Like, is that a priority for you when when you work on a book project?
Yeah, most of my books are written in InDesign or, page layout software because I need to be able to see the flow and what's on a spread and what people are gonna when they're gonna encounter something. And it's not about like artistic expression. It's really about about really shaping the content, delivering the content with a reader in mind, and also the writer, me.
Yeah,
'Cause
right.
I love seeing, like, what shape is the paragraph? Is this paragraph twice as long as the
Yeah,
one before it? Maybe it should be 2 paragraphs.
right.
And writing is very visual,
Yeah.
so that's important to me.
And then and then what about the physical construction of the book? I'm guessing you have a pretty close relationship with your publishers where you really, like,
Yeah,
get
they
into
treat
it?
me well, yeah. They let me design my books, which, most publishers do not wanna get into that
Yeah,
'cause it causes problems, it's
right.
labor intensive for the editor. Editors wanna, look at Microsoft Word documents and do track changes, and so it's laborious, but, they allow me to do that and to create books that are beautiful and feel good and have this intense relationship between the
Yeah,
form and the content.
yeah, absolutely. You mentioned, earlier about this sort of internationalism, so I wanna talk about Extra Bold. I'm gonna crack it open for folks so they can hear the book open. So this, well, why don't I ask you to talk about Extra Bold, because it is a collection of multiple folks, and there's a few chapters I wanna
Yeah,
talk to you about in detail, but maybe tell us a little bit about the history of where this one came from.
sure. So the idea for the book came from an event I attended at the Pratt Institute in New York, where these 2 young women were graduating from Pratt, and they organized an event about the missing women in graphic design. And they felt that as students at Pratt, they were never shown a canon beyond white male designers, and these were 2 young women of color, and they put together this event, and they asked me to speak at the event, which was I was very honored. But what was really interesting, it was like a huge crowd of young people that attended from all over New York. People had driven from Baltimore to see it.
Oh, yeah.
It was
Yeah.
amazing, this a
Yeah.
student organized event. And I thought, "Wow, there's really a hunger for this content, and it would be fun to collaborate with these 2 women
Yeah.
and have their point of view and their references," and, they did a lot of interviews with designers that they admire and really shared their life story in the book. And as the book grew, it became clear that there needed to be more people in it, um I worked with Kalina Sales, who's a Black graphic designer, Joshua Halstead, who's a disabled graphic designer, Leslie Shaw, who's a non-binary graphic designer. So it was so important when you're writing about this kind of material to be inclusive and not, be speaking for others and so forth. Yeah. And then many other contributors who contributed essays, interviews, illustrations, dozens of people. So it's very collaborative and super very intense, like having a big dinner party and doing all the dishes, like
Yeah, right, right.
all the
Pulling it
cleanup,
all
all
together.
the technical stuff,
Yeah.
fell to me, which is
I
fun.
mean, there are several essays in here that have struck with me, but one in particular that I wanna, bring up and get your perspective on is, this chapter by Kalina Sales that you mentioned on typeface. She uses the word typeface, so we'll stick with typeface. Typeface and sort of people's experiences. So I just quickly want to sort of paraphrase one of the chapters. Uh, Kalina writes, "Consider how experiences with wealth and poverty seep into our design aesthetic. If someone grows up poor in a family that struggles to make ends meet, that person might view wealth as a fantastical, idealistic way. If asked to design a logo for a financial institution, they might opt for a representation of money that matches those idealistic feelings, such as gold, extravagant, glitzy, and big." And so I'm curious about like how yeah, what your take is, or what your thoughts are, what your perspectives on font and lived experience.
It blew me away when Kalina wrote that,
Yeah.
and it cast such a light on the way the graphic design industry functions. So, like, designing for fintech or banks is a huge part of the graphic design industry. Just last week, Pentagram introduced a new identity for PayPal that's, like, super clean, sans serif typography, really crisp little animations, and it looks the way, um, mainstream, privileged people think finance should look, like that it's a service for people. And Kalina, shone light on the fact that if you grow up in a neighborhood where there aren't banks, there's like pawn shops and Western Union and cash economies and you're not going to immediately think of a big sans serif typeface to represent a bank. And so to think that way is really mind-opening.
Yeah. And so do you and your students as an extension, I guess, how do you think about integrating the lessons from Kalina's essay, but also from others into your teaching and then into your work?
I have many international students, including students from India, China, Korea. Um, those are the main places. And these are countries that are very different from the US. So last week in my design theory class, we read a piece about sort of revolutionary ways to think about design education, to decenter it, to make it less Western focused, to challenge the status quo. And we had a discussion in class where my students from India were like, this is so far from the way we have ever viewed education, which in their country is very authoritarian, very top down, um, often punitive, like corporal punishment in elementary school, like stuff that's illegal in the US, it's still practiced there. And that was an eye opener for me that, like, we walk into a classroom in the US and presume a kind of liberal consensus and that people are coming from a kind of similar view of how the world works and what democracy is, what freedom is, what religious tolerance is, what social hierarchy or equality is. And so it's really important for educators to understand that not everybody comes from that background, even in the US,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right?
Right, right.
Let alone in a country like India.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I've been focusing on a lot in the last few years, in my work at Urban is, and I come from a quantitative economics background, but doing more qualitative work, right? Getting, talking to people, which is very, I mean, many economists are will disagree with this, but most economists are very comfortable behind a computer with digital data, never talk to a human being and just move on. And I don't. That is clearly not the same, I would think, in design, where there's more discussion and conversation with the end user. And I'm curious how you go about teaching students about that process, and especially in this perspective of how do you sort of gather a wide array of
Mhm.
perspectives of possible clients, possible customers, possible users.
Well, we have UX and user experience courses at MICA. My classes, I teach a design theory class where we read and discuss a lot of these principles of human-centered design and critiques of human-centered design and, it's more of a academic, a thinky talky class, I call it. And then in the makey doey classes, we are more focused on, like, their voice and them developing their content and visual language and skills as designers because they're graduate students. But many of our students do bilingual projects. They look at, the need for typefaces in Indic languages, for example, or, projects that kind of merge Chinese and English. So there's a lot of interest in cross-cultural graphic design. We don't do
Mm,
a lot of user research. It's like we're not, doing business-oriented
yeah.
projects, so it's not really feasible, to sort of do research on human subjects has all
Right.
kinds of limitations, so if you're not really doing it,
Yeah.
it's a tough thing.
Yeah. It's a
Yeah.
tall task for sure. For
Mhm.
sure. Um, I'm curious about your work outside of the classroom and outside of writing books. Like, what are the sorts of things these days that like get you excited about, you know, designing, creating?
Well, I've gotten really active on Instagram, and I have a sort of persona on Instagram that does these little design lessons, working on one just a few minutes ago. And I really enjoy that. It's like a kind of merging of my teaching in a classroom with writing, with public speaking. And it's fun because it's like this really big audience that people you don't know. And I really enjoy that. And, I'm not working on a book right now, I'm a little bit
It's
between
like
books.
that's what I was gonna say. Based on how many books you have out, like that's probably
Yeah,
rare.
I hope to do another one, but I'm kinda waiting for the muse
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
strike me, and I'm enjoying alternatives to books,
Yeah. So so
more
so
hands-on stuff.
right.
Yeah.
And what about the Instagram? Like, what is I'm guessing, and I've seen, I mean, I've seen a lot of the videos, but I'm curious about your interaction with people. I mean, that's the one thing that makes it social, right? So, like, what
Well,
do
there's a lot
you?
of comments,
Yeah,
and then I end up following people, and I'm especially interested in the baking community on Instagram, so, like, I aspire to that.
yeah, yeah,
The people that follow me are graphic designers, but
yeah.
the people that I follow are like these bakers that do incredible, tour de
Oh,
force,
right. Yeah, yeah, right, right,
cookies and cakes and
right.
stuff, so I just there's like a whole instructive layer of the internet. We talk about it being enshittified and commercial and it's all sales. There's so many people from the beginning that have been on the internet in order to teach. I mean,
Hmm.
podcasting is part of that.
Yeah,
People wanna share knowledge, and this
right.
goes back to the earliest days of the internet and, of course, precedes it. And I've just always loved that part of what we do. It's this kind
Hmm.
of teaching and sharing and learning. There's so much
Yeah,
to learn.
yeah. Do you find in your sort of Instagram community, in the design Instagram community, that you're able to have sort of conversations about design techniques? Because I so one thing I struggle with a little bit about Instagram that I thought old Twitter really was good at
Mm.
facilitating is the conversation and the debate, and in the data viz world, at least it was healthy debate, but I don't get that
Debate
same.
is hard. I feel
Yeah.
that people, really love to say nice things, but they also like to say mean things. And so having a debate about a topic, it so quickly devolves into trolling and negativity. I mean, this PayPal logo by Pentagram, you wouldn't believe how negative the comments are,
Mm,
and something might get thousands and thousands of likes,
right.
but then the people that bother to write something are, like, so pissed off.
Yeah.
I'm
I
like,
mean, it is, yeah,
"Why?" What are
yeah,
you so angry
yeah.
about?
I mean, the distribution of people who rate things online is not the true, distribution, right? It's very bimodal. It's the ones and the fives and nobody in between.
Right, most people don't bother.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, so, yeah, I don't really think it's a conversation exactly,
right.
but there's a lot of people you can hear and listen
Mhm.
to, and you can have your own voice too.
Yeah. I wanna ask about, this may be a little far field, but because it's on everybody's lips these days, I'm curious about technology and AI as it applies to design. Um, how do you see things evolving?
Oh dear, the AI question.
Yeah, I
Um,
know. I hate asking it, but it keeps it keeps coming up everywhere. And in the data viz world, I think it comes up a lot. And okay, I could use chat GPT type thing to help me solve a coding problem. Because it is sort of like a Google search on steroids, which I think is really useful for. But then on the creative side, how does it come into play? Is it useful? Is it dangerous?
I think that one of the problems is that it makes so many mistakes,
Yeah.
including in coding.
Hmm.
So, like, you really have to know what you're doing to find the mistakes. And
Yeah.
I had a student had a chat GPT image in a presentation last week, and we allow them to do that as long as they credit what they're doing. Anyway, you can tell. But she wasn't hiding what it was, but it was an anatomy of a leaf. And it was kinda cool looking and, labeling the different parts of the leaf, but a lot of the words were made up, and she didn't know that. She was a Chinese student, and she didn't
Yeah.
know that some
Right.
of these were, like, not spelled correctly, and they were, like, mushed together fake Latin words. So,
Right.
like, before it can take over the world, it has to get more accurate, and it just feeds on what humans already created, which is often untrue.
Hmm. Well, I also wonder, as it applies back to our conversation about the extra bold work, how it reflects stereotypes and biases that already exist. And as the tools get used more, it kind of is in this, it's not a virtuous feedback loop, it's a vicious feedback loop where we sort of amplify these sorts of these negative components or perspectives.
Or positive, like a friend of mine likes she's a musician and she likes doing like AI portraits of herself.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's like she's my age.
Yeah.
And then AI makes her look like a maiden from a, Art Nouveau
Right.
cigarette ad, and we are not maidens. So to me, it's like it's so icky,
Hmm.
It's like, can't we just look the way we look?
Right.
And, like,
Right.
it's okay, look,
It's okay to age. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
right, Kamala Harris is my age, she looks great,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
whatever. I So this kind of the sexualizing and the little wasp waist anime, everybody becomes this, like, perfect little doll.
Hmm.
I find that disturbing.
Yeah. Do you think, aside from the disturbing visual components of it, do you think, and maybe this is a question for your friend at Monotype, like, do you think it can be used well to create new typefaces?
I do. There's a designer at MIT who I know, Vera Van de Sype, who is experimenting with things you could do with AI. So that if a graphic designer, type designer, font designer drew 6 letters and
Right.
got all the details the way they want them, could AI do the rest of the
Yeah.
letters?
Right.
And that could be potentially valuable in creating more international typefaces, for example, for underserved language communities where the labor and expertise required to create these fonts is huge. And what if you could have AI do a lot of the work and then the native speakers are critiquing and shaping it and making it better? So there are potential uses for it. The fact is, in the Latin world, English, European languages, we already have too many fonts. Why do we need AI to make
I was
more fonts?
I was gonna ask, like, does it exhaust itself at some point?
Well, there's only so much of a market,
Yeah.
and every day I get emails, more beautiful fonts. I look at them all. I want them all,
Hmm.
but I can't even keep track of the fonts that I've already downloaded to my computer or
Right.
activated on Adobe Fonts. It's a lot. It's a
Yeah.
lot to keep in your mind which fonts you like and have and what they do, what they look like.
All right, so with that, I guess the key question that probably maybe nobody wants to know, but I'll ask it anyways, which is like, what are your so two-part question? What are your favorite fonts? And since the world is Microsoft driven, what do you think about the move from Calibri to Aptos as the default?
Okay. Very nice. Well, the book you mentioned, Extra Bold, is written in a beautiful typeface called New Braille Alphabet, which was originally designed in the 1960s by Margaret Calvert, who's a British graphic designer. And she developed this alphabet for use in railway signage in the UK. And a typeface company, 10 years ago, worked with her to create really a modern digital typeface
Mm,
that all of us can use for a price.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it's really beautiful. It's like very clean and simple. It does not have a lot of weights, but it's a good functional typeface. And I used it for Extra Bold because I wanted to have a typeface designed by a woman. And I wanted a typeface that had that kind of clarity, that could be strong for headlines and light for text. So I love that font. Yeah. Um, and I like Aptos. It's Calibri I never was into, so I don't
No.
know why people are shedding tears for Calibri. I, I
I
just
don't
think
either.
it's
Yeah.
sort of I don't know, it has like a goofy handmade quality to it
Yeah.
that I don't like. Aptos feels more like modern and crisp and neutral,
Right.
which
Right.
is a default typeface should be
Yeah.
neutral.
Right. Right.
So I like it.
Do you find that are there typefaces you see used a lot that you wish would be eliminated from our
Well, I'm not a big fan of Times New Roman,
Mm.
but one of my former students is actually writing a whole book
On Times New
about
Roman?
time, yeah, and about how its history and how it came to be everywhere, and I
Yeah.
will be fascinated to read it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just the heritage, like, I wouldn't wanna
Right.
get rid of it because it
Right.
has such a long arm, as we
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming on the show.
I loved it.
Yeah, this was really fun. So thanks again. So okay, so where should folks find you for more Ellen Lupton content and to make sure they see the next book because there will be
Well, I
one.
have a website, ellenlupton.com, and you can follow me on Instagram at Ellen Lupton.
Terrific. Okay,
Pretty
we'll make sure
basic.
everybody does that and
Yeah,
make sure everybody checks out these books. So again, thanks a lot for coming on. I appreciate it.
I loved it. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for tuning into this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you'll check out Ellen's work at ellenlupton.com. You should definitely follow her on Instagram. Her videos and her reels are really fun to watch. Even if you're not a designer, they are really fun to watch. I hope you'll check out her book, Thinking with Type, also Extra Bold that we talked about. Extra Bold I really loved, especially the first 2/3 of that book. I really got into. The last third is really on jobs and occupations in design, which is not me as I'm not a designer, but the first 2/3 of that book are incredible. So I hope you'll check it out. I hope you'll subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're watching it there. I hope you'll rate or review the show if you're listening to wherever you are. And of course, as always, check out policyviz.com to learn more about all your data communication needs. So until next time, this has been the PolicyViz podcast. Thanks so much for listening.